Welcome to Beyond Belief, Tales of Religious Exodus, where we delve into the personal journeys of people who've left fundamentalist religions. In this series, we explore their experiences within religion, their journey out, and how they found meaning and healing on the other side.
So, welcome to Beyond Belief. And in this episode, a special fancy episode, we have me, your host, Shalom Shore, being interviewed by my very own Aviva Zeldman to kind of flip the script a bit and have me talk about my journey out of fundamentalist religion. So, Aviva, thank you for being the interviewer today.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm really excited about it. I'm wondering if you want to say a word of context about me being your very own, what that means.
We were married for 6 years. And then we got divorced, and we are still in a relationship, and I still threaten to divorce you every day.
Yes, one of the best features of our functional relationship. Okay, so I'm going to be following a very similar script to the one that you have followed with all of your other guests.
Okay.
Just so we're covering all the same basics, and then I may insert a question or two here and there that are just interesting to me or that I want to know. And I suppose it would be best if you sort of pretended like I didn't know some details that I already know, just so that we're getting a full picture.
Okay.
So the first question is, what's your background? Where did you grow up, and what denomination were you raised in?
Yeah, I would describe myself as having been raised Orthodox Jewish broadly, but specifically I oftentimes describe it as Evangelical Orthodox Jewish, and with some caveats, because people think evangelical, they think Christians, and they think somebody who goes out and makes non-Christians Christians. Whereas the Kiruv movement that gets people to be more religious in the Jewish world only cares about Jews. We try to get Jews to be more religious. But other than that, the act of evangelizing, of trying to get somebody more excited about an idea, is actually very, very similar. And a lot of the same tactics are used of, they call them conversion suppers, I think, when you have Shabbat guests over, a lot of the same apologetic narratives, and a lot of the almost personality types and behaviors are parallel. So it's actually a very concise way of describing it. So I was raised in this unique combination of general Orthodox Jews, for example, at school, but then at home, there was the aspect of this fundamentalist kind of evangelical messianic vibes that even regular Orthodox Jews don't often have. And there was a real mix there because my parents were not raised religious themselves. And so their journey into religion occurred in their late teens, early 20s. And that meant we were in this sort of in-between limbo between the secular and religious worlds, where in many ways they bought into religion. They didn't know fully what they were buying into, frankly, because they weren't raised in it. And they still had one foot still in Western society, as far as music and movies and culture and some amount of valuing education. And honestly, I think that foot that they had in Western culture was kind of their saving grace. To the degree that we are not completely fucked, myself and my siblings, is because of that amount of exposure that we did have.
So there were upsides to the fact that they didn't originally themselves come from this community.
Yeah, I believe so. I think I would probably have been worse off in probably almost every way, if not. Although the challenge of not fitting in, of feeling like an outsider, was exacerbated by them not being part of it themselves. If they knew how to walk the walk and talk the talk, I might have grown up more organically and felt more of a part. I don't think that's 100% true because my personality is the way it is, and I probably still wouldn't have fit in, but that definite feeling of an outsider, my parents don't know what's flying, I was conscious of that at a young age, and that was probably an aspect of it. So in some ways, I guess it made things worse, and in some ways it made things better. I think, for example, the school that they chose for us to go to, even Orthodox Jews knew that was a fanatic school. Even most Orthodox Jews knew not to send there. And they would have sent me to a marginally better school if they had been born religious. It would have still been a religious school with all of the bullshit inherent in that. But that level of intensity, they had no idea that there was actually a spectrum and that they were choosing probably the most extreme version of that spectrum. It was like going to Hasidic school without being Hasidic, I would say, is kind of the vibe. And generally, ex-Jews who come from a Hasidic world have been more fucked than somebody leaving a Lithuanian Litvish yeshivish school, because the amount of insular type of experience is even more intense in the Hasidic circles.
It's probably also worth mentioning that there was the cultural divide, as in your parents grew up in a different country. So even if they did themselves grow up religious, they still didn't grow up Israeli religious. And all of those like tiny little nuanced differences actually could feel very significant when you're in these communities.
Yeah. My parents
Yeah.
told me stories of, like, my father had an American secretary and she worked for him for 10 years and she was great. And he watched her at some point get married, have kids, and then move back to America to raise the kids, because the American Orthodox knew you cannot raise your kids religious in Israel. It's going to be a completely different vibe. And conversely, they saw a few of their friends manage to do it successfully, to really move to Israel and be Haredi Israeli. But what that required was the father to really put his nose to the grindstone and really just do it and commit. The commitment has to start from the parents. And in my case, the parents were not committed at all. They were working a job when Haredi men don't work jobs. They were being artists. My mother didn't dress the way the women dressed. She did her own thing, but she threw us into the deep end of the swimming pool of what the children went through. And that was really unfair. I remember from a pretty young age just feeling like my parents get kind of to do whatever they want. My parents never had to go to school, this kind of school. They got to play hockey in the summers. They got to have summers at all. And here I am day in, day out. My parents can't even help me with homework. They can't help me with what I'm studying because they never had to study this type of stuff. They don't even understand what it means for me to be studying this stuff, especially my mother. It's not like math. Some people are better at it, but everyone knows what it is. My mother didn't know what Mishnayos was. She probably never cracked a book of Mishnah open in her life because she wasn't raised religious, and then religious women aren't shown that stuff.
So they were sort of subjecting you to a childhood that they didn't understand and couldn't relate to.
Exactly. I think they had a narrative that this was somehow better because it was in alignment with what God wanted, and that there was this recurring. I'm suddenly remembering there's a recurring narrative at Aish around like, oh, I wish I had the childhood you have. This was really common. The Baal Teshuvos were sitting there trying to learn Hebrew at 25. They're like, oh my God, you can run laps around me with your Mishnayos by heart and stuff like that. And because they were idealizing that, they reverse idealized it, that they would have loved to have been doing that from the age of 6. And maybe it's true. Like, if this is the word of God and you get a leg up on it from the age of 6, I suppose that's the way to do it. But I certainly didn't see it that way. I saw the Baal Teshuva as kind of having their cake and eating it too. You get to have sex with all the girls and you get to do all the things you want to do. And then you get to be there at 25 and tell everybody that it wasn't worth it. I tried it and it wasn't worth it. Very nice. Like, I also want to try it to know that it wasn't worth it, was something that I remember thinking.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you can give, like, because it sounds like there's so many intersecting communities that you were a part of. Like, you were the child of Baalei Teshuva, people who didn't grow up religious themselves. You were also part of what you're calling Evangelical Judaism within this community. And then if you can just give like the titles of all of these different identities or communities that you kind of fell under that, yeah, maybe overlapped or clashed.
I describe it as 3 layers. I think it's the 3 layers of suffering that I was put through. Sometimes I refer to it as the shit trifle. And the first one was my parents' choice to raise us in Israel at all. Like, Israeli society, Hebrew-speaking people, whatever it means, not even religious, is so different. It's the Middle East, and we can just own the fact it's the Middle East. So they were deeply Western. They grew up in Canada and in New York, and to move to the Middle East is itself a huge undertaking. It's a world where things run differently, and we weren't integrated very well into that. We were pretending to be expats while not being expats at all. Expats usually get to go to private English schools and have servants. We didn't have that. We literally were just integrated. My parents would constantly complain about taxes and stuff like that. There was they chose to neither integrate, learn the language, all that stuff, nor live that privileged lifestyle that a lot of expats get to live. They were just sort of in between. And then there was the layer of, I would say, broad Orthodox Judaism, which my parents broadly identified with. So growing up in the middle of Jerusalem, there's no buses on Saturdays, and all the food had to be really, really kosher. We never went to restaurants because no restaurant was kosher enough. But even within that, they had sent us to the most fanatic version. So that's like most fanatic version of Haredi Judaism that they could find. And then there was this piece of Baal Teshuva, Eshet Torah vibe, this very unique kind of westernized orthodoxy that in many ways was probably better. Rabbis would drop movie references. You could watch The Matrix because it would be a metaphor for all mankind. But there was also more insidious. I've spoken about this where there's this fractionation concept. But instead of just being this isolated religious thing that you're in and then if you're just out, they kind of took control of both worlds. They were like, yeah, we also have, Western life, secular life can actually also be infused with religion. And we're going to kind of get our hands on every aspect of this world that you know. And instead of being like, oh no, the world was created in 6 days and deal with it, that classic, they went with the apologetic approach where no, we can make terms with evolution and stuff like that. So when you're deconstructing that, there's a lot more to deconstruct because they've spent the time to insert themselves in supposedly into science and into psychology and into mental health and all these things that they claim to be contributing. They broadly, I would say they were like a personal growth cult. And so that was almost like an insidious or like a downside of it all, where they pretended to be normal. And that's actually sometimes more dangerous than when someone's just plain out crazy, right? We've spoken about this around parents, right? Sometimes you have a parent who's just like nuts. And you're like, okay, this parent is nuts. But the parent that can sometimes do more damage is the one that kind of pretends to be normal and gets beneath the skin and is very insidious. And you think that that's normal because it's much more subtle. And I think that's what Aish is like that. Aish is that subtle, fucked parent compared to the raving lunatic lighting garbage dumpsters on fire that is the rest of Orthodox Judaism. And one is actually more dangerous than the other.
Yeah, it's like a unique kind of mindfuck. I have a question here about your parents' relationship with religion and how they were as parents. And I think you sort of touched on that a little bit. I'm wondering if you could talk about it more directly, and then maybe also if you could make a distinction between the ways in which your parents were fucked up that had nothing to do with religion, and then the ways in which the religious components in particular affected their parenting.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap, unfortunately, right? Where fundamentalist religions attract and get their claws into people with mental health issues. And both my parents did not have particularly good upbringings. One of them might claim that they did, and the other would probably admit that they didn't. But I'll sit here and armchair diagnose them as both having had shitty upbringings. And I joke that mental health hadn't been invented in the 60s yet. Nobody knew of such things, such as being nice to your kids and shit like that, or like actually giving them attention was important, and so on and so forth. And you could trace it back further. I'm reminded of the legendary Trauma Trooper comic, which we should include, but their parents were even shittier. Right. So it just goes way, way back. But the fact of the matter is that they were raised in a fair amount of privilege. They were raised middle class American, upper middle class, some of them, and had really like the technicals of life in front of them on a platter. And I think from that place of privilege, not knowing what they already were given, they chose a life of much more difficulty for the sake of an ideal. There maybe was an emptiness in their life. There was almost for sure daddy issues in their life, as far as like a void that they need the parent to fill. And then they encounter this very charismatic leader, Noah Weinberg, who promised them a very charismatic God, and they try to fill that void in a very clunky, very kind of square peg, round hole kind of way to try to align with that. I would say that my father's relationship with religion was highly intellectual overall. There's always still an emotional component, I believe. It's something that it's serving them in some way. And so even if you need to have your intellect line it up for you, but now you're locked in and now you're safe or whatever that intellect is providing you. I don't believe that we ever are really truly intellectual. That's my personal philosophy. And so he really was persuaded by the proofs of God and then just stayed. And to his credit, I think he has more or less stayed kind of how he was in many ways. Back then, his commitment to the religion and following God's law, I think is actually commendable in a way because it's been consistent, right? And it's something that I can admire in that. He has, over the years, stopped being black and white. I think he no longer associates with Haredi Judaism, but he associates with Rabbinic Judaism. So if the Mishnah Berurah says you should do it, he does it, but the Mishnah Berurah doesn't tell you what color
You mean literally wearing black and white? You're not referring to black and white thinking.
He wore black and white, and he would wear a fedora on Shabbat, the black hat. That was the
As
level
did
that he
you.
did it. I wore it every day. So there was already that like, oh, I'm still acting more religious than my father was. I was wearing tefillin all day long because that was the school that I was in, and he didn't do any of that. My mother has a much more tenuous relationship, I would say, and we've often, in analyzing her, described her as more spiritual than religious. So her relationship with God is a spiritual one where she feels good in God's presence, and that really oftentimes, I believe, is not even such a Jewish God. It's some sort of loving, ethereal being, right? And the Jewish laws for her are taking, I think, more and more of a backstage, or she's bending more and more things. It's all about what makes her feel good, what makes her feel like there's a sense of meaning and purpose. And I think a childhood that was extremely devoid of meaning and purpose, and probably had a lot of suffering that never went explained. And now she has a framework to explain her past. And I've seen over the years become like a lot less religious, like eat rabbanut type of kosher, which is a lot lower than we were raised, or start wearing baggy pants. And she just continuously splits hairs and goes with different rabbis. And ironically is, I think, quite Hasidic in her kind of devotional type of aspect of Judaism, even though she actually raised us as deeply Lithuanian, deeply intellectual. But it's that I'm blanking, ecstatic Judaism. I'm blanking on the exact term that it's oftentimes used to describe this type of Kabbalah kind of infused. Everything is kind of, with Kabbalah, you get to make everything whatever you want. You literally can turn everything into gematria, and it all makes sense on some deep interwoven level. And I think she really enjoys there. It's kind of the equivalent of being like horoscopes. It's like Jewish horoscopes, which it literally is. They have Jewish horoscopes there.
Right. Is this how you would have described her, like, growing up, or is this a recent sort of definition of where she's at?
It's a reverse sense making of it, but I was, when I was growing up, I was very aware of her ignorance, of how much she didn't know, how much she didn't know about culture, like navigating the culture, and how much she didn't know about Jewish law. And she was the parent I encountered a lot more than my father. My father was constantly gone. So I would ask her questions like, why do we learn Mishnah? What is this thing? She had no clue about any of it all the time. Like it was Jewish women get a notoriously bad Jewish education, at least in the Orthodox world. And hers had been way worse because she was an adult who didn't speak Hebrew, and she had done it 2 years at IAD, whatever the fuck they were taught there. And so she was really ill-equipped for any amount of deep questioning. It doesn't even start with her. Like with my father, I can have debates and win. She doesn't even debate. There isn't really any substance there. And I think I was aware of this lack of substance from a pretty young age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and she was the person you interacted with a lot more out of your two parents.
Yeah, and she was very much at a loss a lot of the times as to what to do.
Religiously or generally?
Well, generally, for sure, that goes more into like her mental health and stuff like that. But I was referring here specifically to like, how do you navigate a system where the rabbis don't want to talk to the mothers? They only want to talk to the fathers. How do you navigate a system where you can't really write a note to your child's teachers, right? And emotionally at a loss around this culture that she was deeply bought into, like, oh, this is the culture, but knowing that she's an outsider and knowing that she doesn't really understand it. And I remember her, it's more clear now, but I remember that she would parrot things. Her religious Orthodox rabbis had taught her things of how Orthodoxy worked. She never experienced it one way or the other, but she would then parrot it back to us. She would use terms like card-carrying member of the Haredi society. It's not a term, like, what does that even mean? I don't know what that means, but it's as if you kind of have some ID card and you like put on a literal hat that says that you are part of it. Now you're part of it. And like, it's just like it was as if you get to just declare yourself part of a certain thing instead of actually go through many, many motions that Orthodox Jews do to be there. It was like she was shortcutting it. And the few people who've done it well actually don't shortcut it. They really invest and they wear the bullshit stockings and they learn the stupid greasy language, right? My anti-Semitism is coming out here. But that's what you need to do if you want to do it. You can't just there is no card. You don't get to carry a card. You actually need to go through the motions. And I don't think she ever did. She lived in this little, even growing up in the old city of Jerusalem, which is very unusual. Most Orthodox Jews knew not to live there. It's not a community. That's not real Orthodox Jews. They chose this island, and she would venture forth from her ivory tower and go shop once a week at the Machane Yehuda market and then come back home. And there was no integration. Even Aish didn't even do community well. Certainly, they didn't do broader Orthodox Jewish community. And so she got to live the siloed life and sort of live this fantasy vicariously through us that we were doing it better. We weren't. We were doing it worse.
Would you say that doing it better than whoever else that target person was at any given moment was a big part of what you were taught?
Not so much. There wasn't. There was other sorts of like fucked up philosophies, but it was more like between me and God. It was like if there was competition, it was more within Isha Torah drama. We kind of just felt that we were probably better than regular Orthodox Jews because we were doing kiruv, and that was enough for that. And then there was endless drama within Aish of like who's making more impact and basically who earns Noah Weinberg's love at any given moment, and like who's whispering sweet nothings behind his ear and manipulating him. Who's like there was a lot of that constant drama. Who's fighting for power, who's getting to be his right-hand man and controlling the show. A lot of what you see in like Hasidic communities, actually. They were treating him like some guru rabbi. And so there was a lot of drama there, but I was only privy to like bits and pieces over the years. That it was always clear that there was some constant drama at Aish, but I was never always brought in. To this day, I don't actually know the nuances of the stuff that my father had to deal with when he was there.
Yeah, Aish being the like evangelical component that you were speaking to before. So that was like the sub community within the
Evangelical institution, basically. Yeah. That it was an institution and an ideology, right? They kind of invented a bit of their own philosophy. They were a personality cult and a personal growth cult, right? Personality around a specific person, personal growth as an idea, constantly claiming they weren't a cult, which is Cult 101. And so yeah, they kind of stuck to themselves and ironically failed at the one thing that religion usually offers, which is community, right? Like usually that's the one upside. I never felt like I had community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there like a mitzvah or a commandment that fucked you up in particular that you can speak to?
Yeah, I feel like in this part, I'm echoing a lot of stuff that's already been said by other people. There's the obvious answers to what fucked me up, which is like sexual repression. That's for sure one of the big ones, purity culture and stuff like that. Just not getting sex ed and then completely vilifying the sexual urges that one does have. But that was huge and really, really fucked me up. There were other more subtle things, like one that I often talk about is this concept of bittul Torah. I really took the commandment to study Torah all the time very seriously and was then plagued by guilt by the huge parts of me that didn't want to do it. And so I wouldn't. In reality, similar to you're not supposed to masturbate, but then you masturbate and you feel bad, I was supposed to study Torah, didn't, and felt bad. But that permeated every second of existence because you're supposed to be studying every second of existence. So to this day, I grapple with stillness and with the silence and not quite knowing what to do with myself. And I think part of that is probably genetic and part of that is probably anxiety at its root. But it having, as we spoke about before, your rote mental health, your raw base mental health issues that we all might have, getting a chance to latch onto something that says, that validates it and encourages it, that's like religious OCD. That's like you take the person OCD tendencies and then you run with it. So I definitely had a lot of OCD tendencies as a coping mechanism. Probably, I think I have like 4 generations of OCD on my mother's side. And to have that be validated and like, have you wiped your butt yet? And to what degree, like that kind of level of like OCD-ness really, really served me in the worst possible way.
Yeah. And what do people not understand about growing up religious?
What do people not understand? I broadly resent the overall attitude of, live and let live that a lot of Western people have. It's like, oh yeah, I'm not religious and you are religious, and that's just both fine. And, comes from a place of liberalism and open-mindedness, but you're actually tolerating intolerance, and that creates a big paradox. And you're tolerating people in your own country perpetuating child abuse, both literally and metaphorically, as in like literal sexual abuse, and also children who are not given an education, children who are taught really, really destructive psychological concepts, and you're just standing by and watching it. And I think a lot of it comes because people don't realize how destructive it is. They're like, oh yeah, fine, so you grew up with Jesus and I didn't grow up with Jesus. But it's not about that. It's about how deeply distorted this child's sense of the world is, compared to what science tells us. Science tells us, and we follow science with every other aspect of life. We follow science to cure our cancer. So science tells us you shouldn't hit your kids, or that you should not tell your kids about hell, or whatever else it's telling you, or that the world is millions of years old. And now you're letting this person go against science in all sorts of ways. And at the very least, that should not be a tax-deductible action.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. Right. And then you're uniquely aware of the particular ways that being a child that grows up religious could be injurious.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've spent a lot of my calling in life is sort of pointing that out, and pointing that out not intellectually, but rather emotionally. That's sort of the angle, the spin. There's many, many people doing a lot of good work around the intellectual journey. Mine has been around deconstructing the emotional weight that religion oftentimes carries.
Yeah. So we mostly covered your childhood. You're a person who ended up leaving religion relatively late, I think, maybe compared to other people you've interviewed. So you have more than just being a religious child. You also have some experience being a religious adult. And the next question is, why did you leave? But if you'd like, you can also maybe talk a little bit about the experience of being a religious adult. And I'm assuming they're kind of related.
Yeah, I've actually never really correlated like adult or childhood. Like, definitely wish I'd left earlier, right? But it really wasn't a possibility. If I think back, like the walls were too thick. I needed to take a few more years of getting punched in the face by God before I was ready to move out. And that's, I think, what adulthood is. You know, adulthood is hard enough as it is. I love the line, adulthood is looking both ways before you cross the street and getting hit by an airplane. And adulthood was really hard, and it's particularly hard when you're thrown into adulthood by your religion. And so they're like, oh yeah, you're 22, you're 19, time to have a child. You've never worked a day in your life, time to support a family, right? That's the kind of adulthood that was in store for me by religion. So it actually made everything worse. It set me up for more failure, which actually caused me to leave, ironically. Had I been given more normal tools, which I see even some people in American society, American Orthodox Jews are a little bit more civilized in this way. They've got a lot of fuckery, but things to do with like livelihood and waiting a little bit longer to date and stuff like that, they do it a little bit better. Me being thrown into the deep end like that ultimately set me up to actually leave, because my journey out came from this sheer disappointment at how bad my life had ended up, clearly because of religion. I could like culminated in a peak suffering, right? Things just kept getting worse and worse. And then there was like a final breakdown, right? When we decided to get divorced was when I decided to leave. And it took me by surprise. And retroactively, all of that hard work that I'd done in my life to be a better person, to try to be a good husband, whatever that meant, that all fell apart before my eyes. And retroactively, there was no meaning anymore. There was no, oh, I did it because there was now going to be this great redemption arc. It had all descended into total chaos and total darkness. So I gravitated towards just the anger broke through. The anger and the pain broke through to the point where I just walked away. I was like, I'm not doing another day of this. And it had to kind of reach a peak, I would say, for that to happen. There were cracks along the way. There were certain laws. I started really resenting rabbinic Judaism. Like, I was like, oh, well, if it says it in the 5 books of Moses, I can't argue with that. But I call it my conservative Jewish phase, you know. But if the rabbis made up some bullshit law about like 6 hours between milk and meat, like, do I really need to follow that? And I played with that for a while. I covered my hair, but not with a kippah. I would do everything that I could do to kind of live by the law as the pure letter of the law and not this supposed spirit that the rabbis were trying to channel, which added endless chaos. I remember when I stopped praying, it was hugely relieving. I always hated prayer. It was very formulaic and non-personal, like this endless talk of having a personal relationship with God, but you're just reading weird sentences that are sometimes in the third person and sometimes in the first person and are praising God for really random shit that I'm like, oh, I guess it's good that there's earth beneath my feet, but like, that's not what I was going to mention right now. And eventually, like, there was no sense of community in prayer. And I remember stopping to pray and like, oh, I reclaimed like 2 hours of my day back. And like really dumb times too. Like, I don't want to wake up at 7 o'clock in the morning. I'm not a morning person. I don't want to go daven at 8 o'clock at night. So it was really great to get that freedom back. But ultimately, I still identified as religious until one day when I stopped.
I'm going to summarize what you say and you tell me this if this sounds accurate, but like religion held all this promise or lots of different promises for doing things right. And you had done all of those things and they just kept failing you until they failed in an ultimate way. And then you were like, I'm done.
Yeah. And I think there was even wrapped in this Aisha Torah, especially narrative. Not all Orthodox Jews believe this, but Aish was like, oh, religion's hard. There's going to be a lot of hard laws, but you're going to get meaning and happiness is going to be your trade-off. So in exchange for doing all these really random stuff, they couldn't always quite explain how it correlated, but it was very clear, the promise. You're going to be happier and more live a meaningful life. So I was like, great, fine. Happiness and meaning is really what I seek. And so I did it. And I became less and less happy. And my life was less and less meaningful. And so that, I would say, that blew up in my face, where I was the most miserable after I'd been the most religious for the most amount of time, cumulatively. And so I walked away, and it immediately got better. And I had those anecdotal stories where I would stop doing this law, and my life would get better, and I'd be happier. I'd stop doing that law. So I had these anecdotal experiences that were already hacking away at my system. I was like, if this is true, then how come when I stopped praying, I became a happier person? And so eventually it all came to a head. Yeah, like you said.
Yeah. Was there, like, besides the defining moment of us getting divorced and that being like, okay, even my marriage is failing, clearly this religious thing isn't delivering, was there like something symbolic that happened or that you did when you left that is memorable?
I often talk about the contrast because I left so suddenly, and most people's journey is more gradual. I've actually had to retroactively heal and deconstruct some things that happened too quickly. But I talk about how I made the decision to leave religion, but I was already booked to be assistant rabbi at my cousin's bar mitzvah. And so I was there, but I was committed to not being religious, but I had to go through the motions, dress religiously, read the entire parsha for them. But I remember little things like not giving a shit anymore and using the urinal, even though they had an electric eye, which is a big no-no, right?
On
And
Shabbat.
On Shabbat, exactly. And the week afterwards, finding myself, I was with the kids the week afterwards, and the week after that, my first free weekend on the beach in Tel Aviv and hanging out with a bunch of just German tourists and telling them this fascinating story. I'd been a religious Jew 2 weeks ago. And I talk about this very symbolic falafel that I ate that I called it tasted like freedom. I'd never had a non-kosher falafel in my life. And just being able to buy it on Shabbat and just eat it because I was hungry was a revelatory and freeing experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And how old were you?
I was 27.
And how long ago is that?
That puts us at around, I'm coming up on 9 years now, which is nice. It's starting to fade, some of the things. I'd forgotten about, someone reminded me, I'd forgotten about 6 hours between milk and meat until a day ago. And I'm very happy to forget about that.
Yeah, and you recently lost track of the Jewish calendar. Remember that being a celebratory moment?
Yeah, I was like, oh, I didn't realize this Jewish holiday is coming up. And I'd be happy if it completely passed without me knowing. But that's, I think, too big an ask.
Yeah. Right. So I think we covered what was your process of leaving. Right? Is there anything else to add there?
Yeah,
because I'm so familiar with the details, it's like I'm afraid my brain is completing some of the things that you're not saying, but they're actually not being said.
I think this is a pretty, some people have gone into even less detail than this in their stories. It's a very personal thing, subjective thing. It's interesting because intellectually, I was almost prepared to leave religion earlier. I think I had a lot of really technical questions that didn't make sense to me. It was actually emotions that were keeping me in and emotions that eventually made me leave. The intellect was always separate. Now, I have had over the years, the book Sapiens and learning more about Rabbinic Judaism and its origins and stuff like that has helped make a lot more sense. But there was deep down a real deep misalignment between what I was being taught and what I was seeing. And I would say an intellectual. It's like a felt sense. Something here is not living up to what it was being said, but that was not enough for me to leave because the promise of happiness and the fear of going to hell, those emotional things were keeping me in more than other things. I talk about the fact I was 6 years old. I'd barely learned to read Hebrew and I was reading Genesis. And I remember encountering this is like the first couple days at school and I barely knew anything and encountering these non sequitur lines in the book of Genesis, these one line verses that make no sense. They're not related to the sentence before. And context was always so important for me. And I remember being so bewildered by, what is this line doing here? I didn't have the vocabulary to ask that question. And I certainly did not have teachers who would have tolerated those kinds of questions. And it's only years later do I realize that that's how the Bible critics actually point out that there's different authors and that those lines were putting at different times. There's this real cut and paste thing that was happening there that I was picking up at the age of 6. And it actually caused me a lot of pain, like emotional pain of the dissonance that I couldn't phrase, that I couldn't describe. Why are things the way they are according to your description of things? But you're forced to suspend belief. So there's a lot of energy gets put into suppressing or keeping at bay these things that really don't feel right.
Yeah. I'm curious what you'd say. So there's this very common disparaging sort of attitude that people within the religious community will have to people who've left religion. And it goes something like, oh, they just, wanted life to be easier. And like the things that you mentioned, it's hard to keep kosher. It's nice to just eat that falafel on Shabbat. Like, what would you say to that sort of, you just left because, I don't know, you wanted all these like hedonistic pleasures of the world, and it's hard for me to take it seriously as I'm saying it, but I'm still, I'm curious
I think part of me does take it seriously. I think part of me for a long time was very defensive around that exact point. It's certainly a point my father continues to make constantly. So I think it lives in my head. I would say my first, and I talk about this with other people on the show as well, most of us are actually willing to still do the more difficult thing for the sake of doing the right thing, actually. There's this real sense that actually a lot of us are really disappointed. There's a category that it never even worked for them. It was a non-starter. I'm not that category. A lot of us were the most devoted. That's the interesting thing. We were the most committed to making it work. We tried harder than everybody else. We kept things more to the T than everybody else did. And it's only when that failed that we walk away completely. It's like an all or nothing. There's a recognition that the way religion is framed is all or nothing. And so if I can't be all, I'm going to be nothing. My counter accusation to a lot of those people is they're actually picking and choosing the parts of religion that works for them. It's almost impossible for anybody to live religion fully according to the law, similar to that thing that you break like 23 felonies a day if somebody was to hold you accountable. Well, this is God and he's holding you accountable. And you and I could probably think of so many people who are religious only because their mind is able to cut corners. They could be like, oh, that's a law that, I recognize I should be following, but I just don't, right? Mm-hmm. And we're not actually able to do that the same way. We have a level of integrity that's so high that if God wants me to do this, I can't in good faith just stop, okay? Mm-hmm. And so that is my broad, I'm deliberately not responding to some of those more detailed accusations. I've parodied them. I've done all that type of stuff. But right. I would say another thing that broadly, very similar, but we all really want meaning more than anything else. So if you really can offer meaning experientially, I think a lot of us are willing to buy in. I'd never have sex ever again if I could actually have meaning that actually felt real and actually be happy the way Aisha Torah claimed, right? Now I don't, so all I have left.
So can I hold you to that? So basically what I'm hearing is your argument is you people claiming this are yourselves seeking comfort, hedonistic pleasures. You're just cutting corners and doing it within religion. And I was not able to do that as a religious person because I did it right. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I think you said that almost better, and that sounded more accusatory than I was going to say, but I think that there's a truth to that. There is a truth that they're actually having their cake and eating it too. The classic modern Orthodox tefillin dates, the Hasidic men who just go to dominatrixes because they want to, and they still live the religious life. No one's pointing fingers at them. No one seems at all like angry about that. The rampant sexual abuse that goes on, nobody's really talking about Orthodox Judaism. They're actually much more annoyed. I think they're not as annoyed as they used to be, but there's a lot more like verbiage and stereotyping around the person who leaves religion than the religious rabbi diddling his seminary girls behind closed doors. Nobody seems to be talking about that, but he's having his cake and eating it too, right? He gets to pray to God in the evenings and then do what he does during the day, right? And so that is actually a lot less genuine and quite rampant. So I'm going to throw those accusations back in religion
Right.
space.
Yeah, and I guess it also goes back to the question of like, is there actually something wrong in just seeking hedonistic pleasures? Like, because the premise of the question is that there is, and you can argue that, there isn't.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I didn't want to go there, but there is a part that's like, yeah, well, cool. Join us. We have cookies.
Right. Sex cookies.
It's all about sex and heroin under the bridge. I'm telling you, that's the two main appeals of not being religious.
It is, if you ask people like that, that is the assumption, I think,
Yeah.
often, or at least the accusation.
I think I've heard some people say that it used to be more prevalent back in the day, and that people have softened their attitude towards people who've left religion. That there's more of an attitude of tolerance. But back when I was growing up, absolutely, it was like known that people left because they just wanted to sleep with girls, and people left and got addicted to drugs, which is also true, but it's because of the behaviors of religious community. Like, you cut people off and give them no tools, they will end up doing drugs under a bridge, but it's still the society's fault. So you can trace it back to the origins. And so we as a society are managing to turn people off because of our own despicable behaviors, which would be a much better way to frame the sentence.
Yeah, better and more accurate. Okay, so since leaving, what would you say have been your biggest struggles with adjusting, and what did you have to unlearn?
It's been a massive struggle. For me, there was the technical sides of being a breadwinner from a very young age and never having a chance to stand on my own 2 feet. So really trying to catch up while grappling with a ton of mental health challenges. So I got up and moved to another country by myself in an attempt to A, escape the religion that was all around me in Israel, and B, to actually make a living. And that was a huge and really difficult thing to do. And I did that. I moved several times. I've had to really heal around like self-esteem, self-worth. Who am I if I'm not being constantly productive? Like that kind of thing. I've had to heal a lot of sexual trauma, a lot of hangups around how I've been taught about sex. And that's been an ongoing journey. I remember my mid-20s still not being able to make eye contact with women. The trauma that I had led to a lot of social isolation. I just felt lonely all the time in the world. I felt like there was me in the world, and that's a very common trauma response. So like every possible layer of my psyche actually needed to heal. And I would attribute the broad healing to just a very concerted effort, a lot of therapy. I had a particular therapist who was very good, but even when I didn't have access to her, I was constantly pursuing at any given point somebody who was helping me move forward. I did a fair amount of meditation. I think meditation was useful for me as a self-regulation tool. And then psychedelics have been huge. Like almost for sure had complex PTSD, which I was healed with psychedelics in general and MDMA in particular. So those have all been really, really helpful.
Yeah. I'm curious if you could speak to like the motivation or drive or willingness to do all these like really hard things in order to heal.
It's a good question. My sister once said this really beautifully. She said that the ability to fall apart is itself a privilege. Like some people, they just stay in bed all day, but that's because they're not going hungry. Somebody's going and feeding them. And I didn't feel like I ever had that. I never felt like I had the privilege to stop and just fall apart somewhere. So there was this like very survivally kind of, there's a resilience to that, right? Some people like literally give up and just die or something. So there was a resilience that I definitely have, probably genetically, interestingly enough. And it was fostered by a lot of hardship over the years that I kind of overcame. So there's a resilience to keep going. I would say that I also get an interesting satisfaction. I'm conditioned at this point to get satisfaction from personal growth. It's something that I have. It might actually not be all good. There might be like an obsession with it, this sense of progress or change. But that definitely is a motivator where I'm actually pushed to constantly be a better person. And that is kind of one of my hobbies, like one of my, in a way, that's where I'm the most spiritual, if you want to define spirituality as a non-religious thing, but like this desire to be better, this spirituality, this desire to push myself out of a comfort zone and try new things and experience in parts of myself that may be dark, but I welcome. I'd like to say that I have a lot of that. I'm wondering if there's like an edge that I wouldn't go to. And if I wouldn't go to it, would I be willing to take a step in its direction kind of thing? And it seems like I would be okay with all of it.
Like there's nothing you can think of.
There's nothing I could think of where I wouldn't be willing to try to step towards that thing.
You often say you'll always try everything at least once.
Yeah.
This seems related to me. Is there anything that you miss about religion?
Yeah, very specific things, and not the things that people usually miss. A lot of people miss community, I think, from what I hear. Never had it. I miss the most these nostalgic moments for when the meaning, when there was these moments where it felt like I was doing exactly what I was asked to do and that I was doing it well. Like I still get high off of those moments when they present themselves. Nowadays, it's just harder to find them because there's no God to come down and tell me I'm doing a good job. But I think part of me is kind of addicted to the you're doing a good job feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember like mid-teens, I had just studied, I'd read the fucking page the 20 times that I had arbitrarily decided I would, literally in a row. That's the kind of religion I was raised in. And, it was dark out and there was the glow of Torah study inside, and intellectually it made sense. And I have this nostalgic draw to the simple life of like, you've got a book in front of you, and then in an hour, you're going to daven and you're going to talk to God, and and that's it. This is the life. And tomorrow you're going to rinse and you're going to repeat. And every word that you read is building the Beis Hamikdash, and it's the best possible thing you could be doing in the entire world, right? And I did a good job of it today. I was actually into it. There was no room for the fluctuating mood, so I only got to enjoy it when there was a good mood. And that was it. So yeah, this like I have this memory of like a Beis Medrash with its lights on and they're like glowing, and you can hear the sound of Torah study. And I'm like, oh, that's kind of where I want to be. And maybe part of me doesn't want to be there, but part of me does. Like that part of me that does. Like I want to be part of that because it's so simple.
Yeah. Is this something that you've been able to experience or replicate at all since you've left, like in any way?
Not at all. Not even close. It's like the world is so broad and vast and meaningless and chaotic, actually, in reality. And we built religion as humans to try to safeguard ourselves against that. And when you let those walls fall, you are faced with the meaninglessness of your own existence, and you can learn new ways of making sense of it. You can learn ways of finding pleasure in the chaos and in like the ultimate freedom that comes from the meaninglessness of it all. You can really be whoever you want. No one's telling you because it doesn't matter. So there's a whole other slice that I'm still kind of learning. But that beautiful simplicity of like, I think people find the closest thing to that in academia. I think, and certain maybe desk jobs like at the DMV or something. I don't know. Like most corporate jobs don't even have that anymore. But like this kind of like just do what you've been asked to do and everything will be fine kind of feeling. I think it was more common in the 50s, but where the world is so big and the information is so accessible that you can really come in contact with just how meaningless you are in particular.
What is it about your journey that you want people to understand, or about you, the person?
My mind immediately went to this period of time where I basically came out publicly as not religious. And I would post all these satirical posts and stuff like that. And there was a lot of different types of interventions that were tried on me. And I think a lot of them were very disrespectful. I'm thinking, I'll start with a positive. There was one rabbi who would always, he had like complete unconditional positive regard. And I don't know how he was as a father. Like it's a lot easier with a random person. But as far as playing that role, he did such a perfect job of like, I couldn't give a shit what you're doing. You matter to me exactly the same amount. And he managed to convey that, which is even harder because I have my guard up around any type of behaviors like that. Oh, hey, how you doing? Right? Like I know where that could lead. And so he did it right. Everyone else did it wrong. And I think that let's see what the different flavors are. There was a flavor of like, get over it. We've all had hard times. Why don't you get over it? That I particularly resent because possibly because I've told people to get over it in my life, in life also, if I own that. But because it's actually really, really difficult. Like they weren't in cheder from the age of 6, right? They're like, oh, we all have our things. We've moved on. It's like, great, you're a Baal Tshuva. You went in when you were 22 and you went out when you were 27, if you feel like it or not. Like this is not equal. This isn't like, oh, everyone just chooses what they want to do and everyone just makes sense of what they want to make sense. I don't get the privilege of walking out. I walk out and I spend 9 years twitching and deconstructing everything that I know, right? So it's way bigger, and you, who's a perpetrator of it, don't get to fucking preach about getting over it. That's like, I think, a huge peeve of mine in that space. And I think similar, the people who tried at that point to try to give me information that would keep me on was extremely condescending. Like, do you not think that I have not done all the research and have heard about your shitty rabbi who you think I should reach and have read that book that you think I should read? Like, it was a combination of either like, what the, like, this is so basic. I remember a friend who was well-intentioned. He was my best friend from childhood. He went and he wrote this long letter explaining suffering from a Jewish perspective to me when he found out that I was leaving. Like, really, like Judaism 101, free will, all that stuff. I was like, dude, come on. I've been at Aish from the age of 6. Like, I've heard this shit and I've still made my choice. And there was variations of that to some degree or another. I particularly resent, this is very broad, this is a pet peeve in religion. It's like the salad bar religion thing. People who find a certain type of religion, some specific rabbi who lives in Nachlaot and has a specific white kippah and Birkenstocks and plays the guitar a specific way, and his Torah is your Torah, and it works for you. My mother is notorious at doing this type of stuff, and I really resent it, because if it's really the word of God, I've heard Christians have similar issues on a much macro level. This is a micro example of that. Why did I have to wait till I was 36 to encounter this specific rabbi who does it this specific way? Like, I was deserving of that when I really needed him in my early 20s, right? So if the world is chaos, consider yourself fortunate. But if it's all the word of God and I'm thirsty for the word of God, how dare he deprive me of it for the first most important years of my life that now I discovered. I remember discovering Tanya, which is a Chabad text that I really enjoyed, and discovering it way too late for it to make any impact on me. And I had been raised my entire life that Tanya was the word of the devil, right? That's how much divide there is within Orthodox community. It's like, you definitely should not be studying Tanya. And when I finally did, it was amazing. So how do you deal with that level of contradiction when it's all supposedly the word of God, which is what I dealt with constantly? So I think that answered that question really specifically for those who are still religious, which would come up for me.
I was noticing that. Yeah. Is there anything that you want people who like are encountering you now in your life or don't have any background like this? Is there something you want them to understand about you and your journey?
It's a good question. And now that you ask it so literally, I think that it might explain this almost like oversharing tendency that I do. It's like, I used to do this way more, but like, hi, I'm Shalom Tzvi, and I left fundamentalist religions. I used to be an ordained Orthodox rabbi. Like, all of that right out of the gate. And I think I was trying to explain to myself or to them why I felt so different, why I felt so isolated, where even though they're right in front of me, and I know people struggle with this anyways, but certainly it's very easy for my mind to latch on to social isolation that's geared around you just grew up in another world. You grew up maybe across the street. In my case, no, I grew up halfway across the globe, and you grew up in such a different upbringing that you had to learn how to make eye contact, and you had to learn what dating looks like. And there's a lot of norms that everybody knows with nuance and that you never learned, like little social cues and stuff like that. And I kind of want there to be a caveat, like everything I say, please take in with some amount of grain of salt so that I don't like offend you, or so that you still give me the time to integrate, because I'm still figuring this out. I think that might be part of what's maybe going on there.
So you want them to understand and like give you some grace, and then maybe also understand context that you wouldn't have to like then explain every time.
Some part of me enjoys explaining every time. I think it makes me feel special. I don't know why, it's a bigger conversation as why I need to feel special like that. It's more, I think right now, it's like, how do I stand out in a society where everybody, went to the same high school and listened to the same bands from the 90s and the 2000s, and I didn't know a lot of that. How do I merge into that? And then, like you said, it's a combination of like, can I have some grace for the fact that I didn't? And can I then stand out, not for having done it, but having not done it? This is going to be what makes me cool. Like, you guys are cool because you can name drop rap songs. I'm going to be cool because I can't. right? And so I'm just going to take that. It's a very Jewish thing to do, to take your oppression and make yourself special because of it. I'm going to grab the water.
Okay. Is there a moment you can point to that made you feel like you had really moved on from religion?
I recently quit a job working for Orthodox Jews, and I've spent the last few months really kind of decompressing. And I'll check within myself. Until very recently, there was a sense of identity in myself, until very recently, as somebody who had left and somebody who could trace a lot of my struggles in the day-to-day to my past. There was a real sense of like, oh, childhood and the school I went to and religion. And it was this like thread that I could really sense connecting. And it was almost like a narrative crutch. Like I needed to explain why my life sucked that much in the current moment. It was because of the past. And I've noticed recently, very recently, that's faded. That there is no, my life isn't perfect right now, but I don't no longer make backwards connections. It's like in the here and now, something isn't working, let me deal with it, something like that. There isn't this perpetual obsession with the past. And that's like an overall feeling that I'm left with, which is actually really nice. And it's about time, frankly, 9 years in. And I think little things like, realizing that I'd forgotten about a specific law, or realizing that I didn't realize there was a Jewish holiday coming up, or forgetting the details of what that Jewish holiday entails, those are very, very welcome. I would very gladly remove almost all of my past memories from my mind and start from scratch.
Yeah. So this is a similar question, are there milestones you found yourself going through? And then I'll add a question about where you are now. Like, if you were to define yourself in the past as a religious Orthodox Jew, how would you define your current state?
It's funny, I've been doing some work around identity with a coach that I'm working with recently, and so coming up with different labels. They're ultimately just labels, but when I have to give myself a label now, I kind of think of myself as an entrepreneur who's particularly passionate about mental health. Like I really want to lead a mental health revolution. And at the same time, a bit of an activist around fundamentalist religion, like a no tolerance voice against fundamentalist religion. And one feels more like a passion that I really push for, and one's kind of like something that informs me, like a side project. Like there's like different levels. Like entrepreneurially, you got to make money, but then my real passion, that I might put many hours in the day into might be the mental health stuff. And then there's this like side thing that I maintain of this like freedom fighter, essentially. Milestones. I remember the decision to leave was itself extremely freeing, and that year in Israel was actually a very, very good year. I decided to be financially irresponsible, which I paid for later, but I didn't worry about money much, and I just kind of socialized and explored a ton of new stuff, and really I would go to Tel Aviv all the time. It was very freeing. I still nostalgically remember that first, because there's so much contrast between where you were and where you are now, but I was in the same environment, so in that way, it was actually good for me to not have to deal with so many changes. I moved to North America, and that was a phase, like really having to deal with there. That passed quickly, and then fairly soon after you guys arrived, we started doing psychedelics a lot, and so Canada is really marked with psychedelic healing, kind of hand in hand. And I would say that I was very resentful about being in Canada for several years, and that peacemaking with Canada probably only started about a year or two ago. There was a real settling down of my psyche, and that like an inner peace that kind of was needed for that to happen. I don't know which came first, but an acceptance of things as they are, not as you want them to be, kind of feeling that I would say that I've been living with for about a year. My circumstances are far from perfect, but it's like, okay, they're actually not that bad, and I'll make do with what I have. And I really feel like, starting last summer with, trying to do a week in Toronto and really trying to like find more activities. I went rowing, like all those things that I tried to do to once again, really feel like I have some sort of familiarity and some level of like settling, which I don't know if I'll ever feel. I think I'm the type of person who might be like inherently restless, but
you don't say.
Yeah.
Okay. If you could go back to your younger self, what would you say or do?
It's a tough one, because I don't know if he would have been open to hearing anything from me due to the amount of brainwashing, but I would have tried to communicate the following. I would have said, all of these questions that plague you, they're real, and it's not something that's broken with you. It is broken in society. I know it's unfathomable to imagine that everybody else is fucked and you are normal, but that is actually the case right now. The reason you're the only one in class raising their hand is not because you're dumber than everybody else, it's because you're smarter than everybody else. And like, I wasn't told that I was smarter than everybody else. And so I just felt really broken because of how everybody else seemed to be fine with what was going on around them. And only I was constantly struggling and restless and all that type of stuff. So I would validate, like, yeah, those feelings that you have, that this is all pointless and this is all bullshit, like, this is actually valid, and maybe find other ways to deal with it. And if you can, leave earlier. Like, I would definitely encourage myself to have left way before I did. Each year that I was religious was a wasted year of my life. And I consider myself only having started living when I was 27 years old. And so if I could have encouraged that to happen sooner, I definitely would have. I had a very interesting memory that, again, came up recently with my coach. In first and second grade, I was not a good student. I was quite inattentive and talking, not trying to cause disruption, but like bored out of my mind, like laughing and playing with my classmates. That was far more interesting to me. And the teachers did not take well to that, and I was smacked and things like that, and sent out of the classroom. I remember being sent out of the classroom and not really caring, actually. Kind of like, great, I'll play outside. There was a sort of sense of like, what is this bullshit? And then my parents intervened. They got me reading Hebrew. Apparently I wasn't good at reading, and that was a part, so I didn't understand. I actually don't know if that's true.
This is their narrative?
This is their narrative, and I remember it specifically. Like, I remember like, oh, you're not so good at reading Hebrew, that's why it's this way, so we're going to have you tutored further. And I remember, I guess, struggling, so maybe there was an aspect of that. Because I don't remember ever being taught to read. I don't know if that's like a thing that people do. Kindergartens teach to read? I don't remember. I don't remember learning to read. I just remember knowing how to read and not knowing that so well, and then having to study with my next door neighbor for a couple months. And at the same time, they implemented this sort of like letters from the teacher, star charts things. My parents were super into the behavioral type of like interventions. And they're like, oh, we want you to get all enthused and we'll give you a prize. And I remember this part of me, it was actually a painful memory, that one day I was just like, I'm fucking doing it. And like being completely extra and over the top about it. Like they broke me and I bought in, and I was just going to be the Orthodox boy shuckle. And I was shuckling harder than everybody else. I was going from fucking back of the room to nose in the book, and it was just really, it's like that shot, that picture of the guy. I'm just remembering that very specific visual. Holy
like
shit.
Whiplash levels of shuckling?
Whiplash levels of like studying louder than everybody. It was unsustainable. I remember getting quite tired doing that. Mm-hmm. But that's what I took on, this persona that I embodied due to social pressure, wanting, I don't know what it was that finally got to me, but it was like, oh, you can get your fix of attention, of recognition. We'll stop oppressing you if you do this specific things. I was like, okay, fine, I'll do it. And I did that for 3, 4, 5, 5th grade. So 3 years I did that. And then in 6th grade, I had a new teacher, new rules, new curriculum, and all those things that I'd learned those last years went out the window. It was a completely new set of things, and I was completely lost. Like, I went back down. I had to maintain the same level of social status that I had earned and the reputation for being the best kid in class, blah, 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 with completely new curriculum and new ways of doing things that nobody trained us. It was, yesterday is Chumash, today is Mishnah. We're going to learn by heart. You never learned anything by heart before in your life. Figure it out. I'm so bad at learning things by heart, word for word. So it was really set up to fail. But all this to say that there was a part of me that remembers the buy-in that occurred. And I would love to buy out.
What was the trade-off? Like, what did you lose?
What did I lose by being that student?
What did you lose when you chose to get the stickers on the chart?
I conformed, right? So I suspended my own beliefs around what I wanted to do or what made any sense at all. And I was like, okay, this is what they say I should do. This is what I'm going to do. And there's a scene in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest where they do electroshock therapy to him, And he comes back and he's all stoic. After the entire movie, he's just like a wild guy who's instigating trouble. And it's like, I think one of the saddest scenes, right? They broke him. They succeeded. They did what they did. And now he's just another broken, institutionalized person. I think I saw a part of that in me to some degree. Like they just got this, they got this behavior out of me. There was a lot of anxiety that was required to stay there, a lot of exertion of effort that was not true to my authentic self, right? This is a part I was working on authenticity. It was not authentic for me to sit there and chuckle that hard and read Chumash that loud, because no part of me really bought into that. Like, why? What is this thing? A part of me at least didn't buy in. And so to do that meant to actually put a lot of effort and a lot of anxiety into sustaining that.
Do you feel like you've reclaimed that thing that you had to leave?
I don't think so, actually. I'm remembering that there was a distinct social quality to being the troublemaker. I remember it with friends. I remember this sort of like, we're just going to fuck around together type of feeling that I still had. It's interesting because Hebrew was not my first language, but I have these memories of like playing with friends and like giggling and stuff like that. And I feel like a lot of that had to be suspended. Like to be the best kid in class, you have to alienate everybody else who thinks you're a fucking teacher's pet because you are, right? It was a sort of like trade-off of social dynamics for that role. And
So it was like choosing the adults over your peers.
in a way, yeah, which is funny because there was also other charts around me not socializing enough, and I don't know how they correlate, or there was a lot. I had a lot of behavioral issues, and my parents dealt with all of them with star charts.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
When you say your parents, you mean your mom?
I guess. It was always my mom talking as if she was representing my dad. There was like, Abba and I spoke, and now we're going to do X, right? There was like always this like, I am the executor of a coalition decision kind of thing. That's how I felt at that age. The alienation from my father started later. Like my father really disappeared from my life in my teens, actually.
I see. And so you feel that you haven't reclaimed this like giggly, shirking authority thing that you had.
Yeah, it would be hard as an adult to do some of that, I think. But this real sense of like play and lawlessness that I remember from kindergarten. I remember being very lost too, a lot of times, but there was definitely no.
It's interesting because I think a lot of people that know you today would say that you're hugely into nonconformity.
It's not that I don't conform. Of course I don't conform. It has more weight to it. It has this like real sense of like, now I'm going to not conform. It's like very declarative. It's like I'm religiously non-conforming, as opposed to a very spontaneous, I actually didn't notice that I wasn't conforming because I was so busy non-conforming kind of thing. I have some of that. There's an obliviousness that I certainly carry as I go through life, and that helps with some of that. But it feels more forceful. It feels like I describe a scheduling spontaneity into the calendar is how I describe that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's like less ease. That's what I'm hearing. So you sort of spoke to what has helped you heal. But yeah, if you want to add anything to that, now would be the time.
Funny, a lot of people talk about finding community that eventually heals them. I don't think I've ever found community. I found acro yoga was the closest thing. And I think at times I have found it healing. But then its absence again is more painful all over again. So it was the closest thing. And then I found Shambhala social meditation was also. That was the closest thing I ever felt to like going to shul. We would go, we would meditate, then we would have like basically kiddush after, even though it was like 8 o'clock at night. But it was like, oh, this is what the vibe that people are going for. This maybe some people are getting from religion, where you have a people with a shared purpose. We're all trying to become better people together, hopefully. That's the narrative I always would like to have. And then afterwards, they hang out and schmooze, right? And that sounds pretty fucking great. Too bad I never felt any of that in the presence of those communities growing up. But it was a glimpse into what people are trying to create or maybe experiencing that I needed a completely different context for. So those are the closest things I have found to community is acro yoga and things. I've tried many, many hobbies. None of them have really translated the same way for some reason. It's just interesting.
In terms of community.
Sort of community, which is a lot of people talk about that. I don't think that my need for community is as fundamental as other people's is. It's important to me and I miss it a lot. But it's definitely not as been crucial for my healing. My healing has been a lot between me and myself, I would say. But that might be selling it short because maybe I do need it. It's funny, my father oftentimes talks about not needing community. And I think both my parents have a real isolationist, introverted vibe to them, and didn't take from religion one of the biggest things that religion has to offer, which is community. I see my father doing more of it now, which is fucking ironic and a little bit annoying, right? Where he's now socializing with all of his guy friends, and they're going to distilleries together in Scotland and stuff like that, and stuff that I've never saw him do. I never saw him just hang out with a bunch of people. And again, maybe it would have been good for me to have that social dynamic modeled, right? And my mother's still a fucking hermit. So there's like nothing there on that front. And yeah, I could use more friends, but I don't feel like Canadians are my vibe, at least not Ontarians, at least not Hamiltonians. Let's be specific. I don't have to throw out an entire country, but it's definitely been hard to find here. What else has helped me heal? I think I've said it all. I don't think, time is a factor.
Yeah, you have
Time's
said
a factor, but
things.
I think people can, if people just let time pass and don't do enough, it's going to be an issue. Like, I think there needs to be like actual interventions if you really want to heal properly.
Yeah. Okay. Finally, I'm just like, there's a few more questions that I'll ask you, but I'm just wondering if I can ask what this was like for you.
Oh, awesome. I actually really enjoyed it. There's a part of me that really likes talking. That's something that I've had to just own. I like the sound of my own voice. And I know I'm actually surprised when other people don't have that. So I've learned that that's a tendency at the very least. I was talking with my brother Jack today, who's a musician. He's also like this desire to be seen. And it's a curious presentation, but I certainly have that, and I kind of own it. And there does seem to be people who want to hear, so that works well together. So it's just really nice to be able to like fucking stand on a soapbox and talk about myself for this amount of time. And I think, as usual, first of all, you're a great interviewer, and I appreciate some of the nuances that come up. I think, certain things that I've never quite articulated that way. It feels like there's an aspect of really, even therapy doesn't do this. I'm thinking out loud, right? You usually don't go to a therapist and monologue with this level of linearity. And I'm curious what would happen if you did, because it feels very cathartic to just like beginning, middle, and end your life in a certain framework in the course of like an hour and a bit. It forces an arc on things that can otherwise feel fragmented.
Yeah. You interviewed a few of your siblings.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if there's anything that like you feel you define very differently than they did, when define that could mean anything, like the way you grew up, is there anything you feel they would disagree with or see very differently?
I happened to interview very opposite siblings. I interviewed Mike and Sim. Mike was highly intellectual on his journey out and very clear in a sense of conviction from the age of 16. That's really what I was struck with when he left. And mine was not nearly as convicting. I remember having like the sense of doubt, the sense of like my emotions guide me out, but the intellect is very confused, or there's like this really ingrained sense of this is wrong feeling that was mixed in. Like intellectually, I know I'm actually fine, but emotionally, this feels wrong right now because of how deep religion had gone. That was one side. And Sim is a bit on the opposite extreme a lot of times, where I think he's too appreciative. Not that it's true, but he appreciates his past way more than I do. Like, I resent my past a lot. I would like wave magic wands and erase most of them still. And he has more of a sense of gratitude for this made him who he is, and it was worth it. I'm like, it's made me who I am, and it's not worth it. Like I talk about being willing to trade a bunch of IQ points for more happiness. And it seems like a similar thing. It's hard because you do get attached to your narrative, whatever it is. But I think that there's been a forgetting that's happened. There's the acuteness of the remembering has dropped away. And I'm actually very grateful for that. I'm grateful that I don't have that level of intense remembering of the past. I think it's a sign of healing, actually. I've seen people in trauma deal in two ways. Some people are like, they just repress the whole thing, don't remember anything. And some people are like stuck with eyes wide open, kind of like Clockwork Orangey towards their past. It's like all playing out in front of them over and over again. And I was definitely in that category of things. And that seems like I would like the most of that. It feels as though I was like in the family, the bearer of record. Like it's somehow like I was the witness of it all and forgot none of it. for whatever reason, that kind of the role. And so almost everybody, I think there were things I just wasn't there for, but it feels like, as far as like, I don't know, family therapy or being the person who raised my hands and say, no, actually, this is what I remember. It feels like that was a big part of like specific anecdotes. I think a lot of people were like, no, the sense of like a parent's absence or a sense of feeling, we can all stand by and say that this was. But as far as like remembering specific anecdotes, I feel like oftentimes I may have been cursed to remember even more of them.
Yeah. And I mean, arguably you were there for a lot of it because you were there from the beginning.
And I was older. So like I'm witnessing it as as a person able of remembering more kind of thing.
Yeah. So now I have a personal question, which is, I was there for a lot of your journey from, I'd say, the age of, you were 21 when I met you?
Yeah.
Right? We got engaged when you were 21. And so I'm curious, because it hasn't really come up actually at all in this entire interview, if you could briefly talk to like how my presence in your life, how you feel that has impacted your journey.
There's two parts to it that I define. And I would say there's the relationship with you, and then there's having a family with you. Like the building a life together thing. Those don't have to go together. Like we could have dated and lived in separate houses and like stuff like that. Living with you was really difficult. That's why we ended up getting divorced. We are not very compatible. You've had your struggles, I've had mine. And there was a lot of additional stress that I experienced while trying to build a family with you. And that influenced it, because that was ultimately a huge part of the catalyst of separating and anger at God. Actually, at some point there was a combination. I was angry at you too. A lot of it I already then recognized was out of your control, and therefore I was angry at God, because like, who else did this to you? God did this to you. And so I had that sense. So it was combined. But I would say that on the flip side, what I got from you positively was a real sense of self-acceptance. Like I did not grow up in an open-minded environment, and did not grow up in an environment of encouraging creativity for pure creativity, as opposed to like, I don't know, selling it, or in a place that celebrated for you just being you, who you are, without your talents, without your like whatever. And you really modeled that. And I got that from you, a lot of encouragement to just be wacky or be zany for its own sake. It didn't have to be for any other purpose, and being really celebrated for who I was as I was. And I think that was actually a really important thing that I didn't know I needed. It's not what I was looking for when I was dating, because I was fucking perfect already. And so to have gotten that surprisingly, I would say in a way, was probably the biggest thing that I've gotten from you over the years, is just the encouragement to the full-hearted belief in myself and whatever I set myself to do, in a way that is different, because my parents oftentimes had it tied to conditions or to worth or to like, what they wanted. And you're really able to suspend what you feel like you would want me to do from what you encourage me to do for what's good for me. And I think it's a huge talent and very much appreciated. Ultimately, it's what allowed me to leave Israel and build this life that I now have. Things like that. That's just an example.
Yeah, I'm curious. I've never really thought to ask you this, but I left religion a few months before you did, and then we got divorced, and then you left. That's sort of like the linear progression of how it happened. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think you left 9 months before I did.
And I don't remember exactly. I'm not as good with timelines as you are. But I'm wondering if you think you would have ended up leaving religion if we got divorced, but I hadn't left religion. So I was still religious, but our marriage fell apart unrelated to the fact that I had left religion. As far as I'm concerned, it had nothing to do with that, except for being a time of change and me questioning all my life decisions, marriage being one of them. I could have stayed religious and still chose to end our marriage. Do you think that would have resulted in you leaving?
Yeah, I don't think it was related at all. In my mind, as I remember it, early on in our marriage, I actually had to grapple with amount of disappointment around the way that you were religious was not the way that I thought I would have a religious home and I was responsible for the spiritual well-being of the whole house. I was much more into like actual letter of the law, and very quickly became apparent that you didn't care about such details, even when you were religious. And there was a disappointment with that. I wanted to have a highly law-abiding family home, and you didn't seem to care. And your relationship with God was not how I conceptualized a relationship with God. And there was a disappointment that I had to work through. And it was superseded by so many other bigger disappointments that it eventually became like a write-off. For many, many years, I didn't feel we related around religion. It's not something I wished that we had at the time, but we didn't. And the way I describe it is that you leaving religion, we had bigger issues already then. And then when I left religion, it was a very solo experience. I actually don't feel like our respective states of religion played almost at all into our anything, actually. If I look backwards, I've never said this so overtly, but we were never really religious together, ever. Like, it's just not a thing. There was some, the laws of family purity that we were keeping, and eventually we stopped keeping parts of it, at least, or something like that. That was really good. We both kind of left that together. And again, that was almost like removing religion. Religion was intervening in some aspects of our life, and we were like, fuck that. And we removed that. And I think our relationship got better. That's what I recall. And so overall, I would say religion didn't really play a part in our relationship, contrary to what both our parents think.
Yes. Well, their claim is that you left because I left.
I think my parents blame you for leaving and your parents blame me. Each parents blame the other.
In a sort of a different way, though. They blame you for making my life so miserable that it made me throw out everything, including religion.
Right.
I'm not sure how your parents...
Which is closer to actually how I experienced you. That's a little bit of a blunt way of saying it, but that narrative is more similar. Like there were many struggles of being married with you, and that did in some ways end up causing me to leave religion. Whereas my parents' narrative, I think, is more about like influence. Like I saw you leaving, and so I was dragged into, which is particularly amusing narrative. Like your parents has one that has, I guess, more nuance. I suppose.
Yeah, despite being completely untrue. Okay, so last two questions. The first is, any advice for others who are leaving that you can bestow upon the masses?
It's funny. I've asked so many people this, but I don't think I've ever stopped to ask myself what I would say. For a second, I would say, off the top of my head, the first thing that comes to mind is go to therapy. Figure out some way. It's always possible to do it somehow. And any therapy is better than no therapy, in my opinion. You might disagree with that. But I think that, especially if you can sort of direct and educate yourself and just get a sounding board out there, even if they don't relate to you at all and they don't know about religious trauma. Obviously, a religious trauma-informed therapist is even better. But any therapist who could just hear you talk, that's already huge compared to the amount of stuff in your own head that you might be grappling with right now. That would be my biggest thing. Everything else would be context related. That's the problem, right? I wouldn't recommend psychedelics to everybody. I wouldn't even recommend meditation for everybody. I would generally encourage everybody to leave. I think everybody is better off not religious than religious, but I recognize that people have all sorts of things that they're balancing, right? People have kids and need to fake being religious, right? I have a lot of compassion for that. People are stuck at their parents' house because they're only 17 years old and they need their parents to get by. There's a lot of factors that can be in. So all I can say with certainty is find yourself your mental health supports that do exist. We had one of my recent episodes with Hannah was really brilliantly said, you probably have somebody in your life who is not religious, and reach out to them and they will gladly support you. It's just that they're waiting for you because they don't want to be inappropriate about breaking a boundary or sounding like they're encouraging you to leave. But if you make the first move, they'll match you. I can think of that in our lives, right? We've got an uncle who supports us this way, and it's hugely impactful. So find your support. It doesn't need to be a formal therapist, but you need to find somebody. No, I highly recommend that you find somebody outside of yourself who can support you through that. That's pretty much all I've got. That and read Sapiens.
I would also recommend, just plug it for you, I would recommend your blog or your website and things like it. I think if you can't access people who've left directly for whatever reason, there's actually a lot of material out there that's written by people who've left religion that could make you feel like there's a sense of community or you're not the only one.
Yeah. People talk about community. For me, a lot of my journey of healing has actually been intellectual alignment, meaning the part of me that
Mm.
deeply knew from a young age that this isn't working, but didn't understand how. When I finally got a website that explained like rabbinic Judaism, or when I read Sapiens and I understood what humans play in the world, science actually can be really healing to diffuse and defray a lot of the random narratives sometimes you don't even know you have, right? So I notice a lot of people go down these rabbit holes of, the YouTube and the podcasts and the books, and that it seems to be a pattern because it is such an important rebuilding of your sense of the world. And some people, I think, gravitate to different topics: philosophy, psychology, social sciences, actual sciences, right? Learn about space. Nothing will help you realize how meaningless you are when you learn about space, and that's a really good thing, right? Like,
Yeah,
everyone can chill out as us being the center of the universe, and
right.
those are the kinds of things that come to mind.
Yeah.
Was there a last question? Yeah,
The last question is if you have anything you want to ask me.
nice. But I know all the answers to everything already.
Yeah, you don't have to ask me anything. I also assume at some point you might interview me, so I don't know.
Well, that's up to you. Do you ever want to be interviewed for the Beyond Belief podcast?
I think it could be fun. Yeah.
Do you have any reservations around doing that?
Yes, I do. I think that I'm generally a lot less. First of all, I'm more risk averse broadly, I think, in life than you are in many ways, and one of them is that my story is a lot less public. I'm like worried about hurting people's feelings. And I'm not saying that disparagingly. I think it's a worthy thing to be worried about in my own family or whatever it is. That's one component. And I think there's something about my journey that feels so fluid and like it's constantly fluctuating that anytime I talk about it, it's like it can't be accurate because it's a moving target. So it's accurate for that particular moment in time, but something like a podcast, I think, immortalizes that moment in time. I think I have some resistance to that because it can't be true for more than like a few minutes or hours or weeks or whatever at a time. But with those caveats, yeah, I think it could be interesting. I think it could be fun also to have you interview me.
Right. We'll put it on our Patreon as which we don't
Bonus
have.
episode.
Our non-existent Patreon as a bonus episode for paying people only. One last question, I guess I'm curious. What role do you feel religion should play in like modern society?
Well, that's a really good question. Should. So, yeah, that's assuming it should play a role.
No, so yeah, it could be that it shouldn't. We disband it completely.
I don't think it's necessary at all. I do think that it will take like there's a few steps between where we currently are and being in a world that could successfully like be harmonious without religion. Right now I think religion is just much more a cause of discord than anything else. So, removing it, it's hard. It's hard to measure the amount of damage it's doing. But I also think that people need stepping stones from being very religious to not being religious and still experiencing a sense of like meaning, essentially. And I don't know, cohesion or community or all of these human needs that we really haven't found a good replacement for. Like that's one thing that moving to North America has shown me, because I think that Israel, even people who aren't religious, are kind of traditional. Like they're still kind of religious, even if they're really not or wouldn't be considered religious from the perspective of the way we grew up. They still are religious compared to, the atheists that I meet in this part of the world. And they have a sense of meaning and family and community. And these are all things that like, they're not plagued by this sense of meaninglessness. And that kind of void in people's lives leads people to behave in all sorts of extremely destructive ways. Religion does this too. But I think that we need to find adequate replacements to certain needs that people have. I don't think religion is necessary for that, though.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that secular Buddhism is the closest thing?
I would say so. I think one difficulty that I have sometimes with certain strands of secular Buddhism is that it could be quite intellectual.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't work for a lot of people, and it need not be the only kind. There's an experiential part of Buddhism that I actually think is a lot more useful and meaningful, and what's the word I'm looking for? Like approachable?
Accessible. Yeah.
Accessible. Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. Accessible. I sometimes, when I'm on retreat, every so often I'll do this thing where I'll collect like pretty rocks that I see, because I do quite a lot of walking, and I'll just place them by the Buddha. And for me, it's reminding myself that even though I'm very intellectual and my degree is in philosophy and I love philosophizing, Buddhism really, healing generally, experiencing the world and being in a body could be as simple as taking a pretty rock and placing it by the Buddha. Like it could be, there's something about that activity that is symbolic, I think, to me in what it could look like. And that part of it, I feel, could be very accessible to your average anyone.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for interviewing me today, Aviva.
Yes. Thank you for allowing and inviting me to interview you. I kind of want to like revisit this in some way in the future and see if any of your answers change.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't feel like I've changed much over the years. Like with this, like I kind of would have said the same thing, maybe emphasize certain things over others. Maybe it will. I think moving forward, Beyond Belief should just be episode after episode of interviewing me.
I do have a curiosity if it would be different if someone else interviewed you. I'm sure it would. I'm curious how it would be different. What things you would say.
Well, part of the thing is here, like these are all questions that I actually came up with, and now you're asking back to me. So that's saying something. I remember a very distinct interview a few years ago, with a friend. And I loved the interview, and he came up with all the questions himself. He was just asking me all sorts of things. And in a way, it's like fun to not know what the next question is going to be, right? Like,
oh, absolutely. Yeah. I'd be down to doing an interview like that. I think part of this was like keeping a kind of consistency with your other episodes.
Yeah, which I think is fair. I think that.
Yeah, and I did insert some of my own questions, but yeah, I definitely... And also this covered the basics, which I think is important. And now that people have the basics, it could be fun to like revisit.
Exactly. Backed by popular demand.
Yes, we will have to create this popular demand.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Belief. If you found the episode inspiring, please share it with others who might benefit from it. And be sure to subscribe to it to get updates about future episodes.